Hi everybody, this is the second video I've done on Logic Pro articulation sets. If you've not seen my previous video on this, you should go and watch that first so that we're all on the same page, then come back here and watch this. And what we're going to do here is look at a few of the questions and comments I got on the previous video, and we can answer those questions and dive a little deeper on this functionality here and see what else we can do. So thank you for the questions, I do appreciate it. So I've got a question from Brian Kelly. Brian said, if I'm not mistaken, the violin patch you used in the previous video already has a built-in set of articulations, so all you have to do is create a custom set in Logic and link it up. Yes. Is it possible to link two separate instrument types, say flute legato and flute staccato, into a single track? I have Hollywood woodwinds and I want to make a single flute track that can have all types of articulations instead of having to walk each family of flute articulations to a different channel. Okay, yes, you can do that. It is different to set up to the previous type that we looked at, so it is worth looking at here. I'm going to show how we do this in East West's Play sampler and also the Native Instruments Kontakt sampler, because it's more or less the same, but it's just worth looking at both. So if I open up Play, it's just a standard stereo instance of Play, and first thing you want to do is come into the settings and go to the other tab and just make sure that MIDI channel assignment automatic increment is ticked. That makes this a little bit quicker. And then I'll open up the instrument pane so we can see what I'm loading up. I'll come to the browser and we'll start with a long flute sound, and then I'll choose a short flute sound. And when I choose this, I just need to select it and then click add at the bottom. Then it goes in as a second instrument. If you were to double click, it would just replace the existing one. And then we'll have flutter tongue as the third one. Okay, so I've got three different patches loaded now. If I come into the player, we can switch between them and you see three different patches. And you can see over here that they're expecting to receive data on MIDI channel number 1, MIDI channel number 2, and MIDI channel number 3. And that's because we set them to be numbered sequentially. So if I were to play some notes now, they just go in on MIDI channel number 1. Over on the left-hand side in my track inspector, which you open up with this, or the I key, you've got MIDI channel. And if I change this, it sends it to MIDI channel number 2, which plays that respective instrument. MIDI channel number 3, it plays the third instrument. So I'm just going to set that back to all, otherwise this won't work. But what we need to automate is what MIDI channel are we sending the data on. And if we can automate that with articulation sets, then we can do this, and we can. So create a new articulation set, and just make a bit of room. So the first one, we've got leg wrap R/4. And the second one, we have short double tongue. Third one, we've got flutter tongue. And all we have to do for these is just tell it what MIDI channel to send that data on, and we can do it right here on the articulation tab. We don't have to go into the output tab, that's it. So now using the articulation switcher, which has appeared, we can switch between them. And so that's it. Now you could go another layer on this. If we were to add in a patch which itself used key switches, then we can also use these. So we've loaded that in, that's on channel 4. If we have a look at it, this also uses key switches. So I'll just call these key switch 1 and key switch 2 and key switch 3. So obviously they all need to go on channel number 4, but there's a second layer to it. So if I choose any of these now, we're going to get the same sound each time, because all I've done so far is tell it to go on channel number 4. So we have to go into the output tab, and now we're doing a second layer to it. So for these ones, we need to set note on, note on, note on, and it's just like in the previous video. But we do have to tell it to stay on channel number 4. So we set channel 4. And now we set our selectors, so we'll use just the first three, C0, and C sharp 0, and D0. And now we can switch between different patches. So here's our double tongue, and there's the flutter tongue. But now we've also got 3 within the same patch. So we have the run down, the run up, and our major run down. So there we go. That's how you can kind of get a second level to this. So different instruments, and even within a single instrument, we can still use those same key switches. So that's how we do it in the Play engine. Now let's switch over to Native Instruments Kontakt Player and see how we do it there. It's more or less the same. So I've opened up just a stereo instance of Kontakt. Let's clear our articulation set there. Okay. So I'll open up the browser, and we won't use woodwinds this time. We'll use some brass. So let's have trumpet. And you can see that that's expecting data on MIDI channel number 1, and I think this is the default behavior for Kontakt Player. I don't think we have to set anything to make that happen, because when I load the second one now, I'll load in the staccato one, it's going to be expecting data on MIDI channel number 2. And if I load in, let's load the effects, and that one expects data on channel number 3. So I think that's the default for Kontakt. You don't have to change anything to make that happen. So now if we choose MIDI channel number 1, yeah, we get data there. Channel 2. Yep. And channel number 3. Ooh. There we go. Just got to find which keys trigger the effects. Okay, so same thing. All we do is we create our articulation set. And for these, I'll just call them trumpet and staccato and effects. And make sure that's on all. It is. So now we can switch between them using this. So, yep, staccato. Oh, hang on, I didn't set the things. Got to set the channels. So channel number 1, channel number 2, and channel number 3. So now we should get that staccato. Yep, and the effects. Yep, cool. So it works. So more or less the same process in Kontakt. It's just worth looking at how we do it there. So you just load up your rack, make sure they're sequentially assigned by their MIDI channel, and away you go. So pretty similar. So that's that. Next question. There was a comment from Zack Hexum who says you have to add the articulation into the switches pane of the articulation set as well, or the articulations won't show up as an option in the smart controls. Okay, so the smart controls we open with command 3, or you can just hit B to open them at the bottom there. I'm not quite sure how Zack was doing it, but I'll show you how I would get them into the smart controls. So what Zack's referring to is the switches pane. So Zack says if you add them here, you'll get them as a smart control. I'm not quite sure about that, but this is how I'd do it. What you need to do is come in and choose the control that you want to assign. So I'll just use this first one. So I select the control, and you might not have the inspector open, so you just hit this to open the inspector. And now we're setting the options for the smart control. What we need to do is change the parameter here, and we choose non-automatable main articulation. Now this is our articulation control, and it's smart. It knows that we've got staccato, trumpet, staccato and effects. It's got the 3 articulations that we set. So now we have a dial that we can control the articulation with. And if you've got a hardware keyboard, then you could just go ahead and learn and move a knob on your hardware keyboard or whatever. And now you've got a real-time control to switch between those as well, which is quite nice. Interestingly, there's a bug I found in Logic, which apparently has been there since smart controls were introduced, which is that if you put this instrument inside a track stack, your hardware controls won't control these smart controls anymore, which is kind of annoying. So that needs fixing. But at least that gives you some means of using a smart control to control the articulation types. Okay, now I think that's the official way of doing it, because that's how the manual says to set up a smart control for articulation types. So again, I'm not quite sure what Zack was doing to get it working, but there's a way of doing it. All right, question from John Enroth. John said, is there a way to view what notes are assigned to which key switch? The one nice thing about having key switches is that you can see which notes are being triggered. Okay, this is kind of weird. So let's just play some notes here. I've got an in. Okay, that'll do. If I open this up, basically, this is kind of strange. You can see this little line here for the trumpet articulation. That's come from our smart control here. Okay, so if I record something and move it while I play. Okay, something weird happens now, which is there's like this data here, and it's come from the smart control, but and you can get it if you don't see it. Open up the you need to open up the automation pane, and you'll see in the recently used, you'll see articulation. But it doesn't work, is how I feel about this. It just doesn't control the data the way you would expect. It has written the appropriate things. So you can see that these were set with the effects articulate, are set with the staccato articulation, and these last ones are set with just the standard trumpet one. So it does record in real time. The only thing is this is now dumb data. I can't use this to change it. If I try and change everything to effects, we're still going to have... we still got what we previously had set. We still have staccato and we still have trumpet. And I think the reason this is because the articulation it's an attribute of each of these notes, just like its velocity. A second attribute is what's the articulation. So you can't really automate it with these with these controls. In fact, I think that this kind of is like unfinished functionality. I suppose at some point we can come in and use this to actually draw in the articulation switches and have it affect the notes, but right now it just doesn't work, and it's kind of dumb. The reason I think it's like unfinished is because if you haven't got any articulation automation written in using the smart controls, you actually don't see it as an option. I can't find it anywhere. If you come to your automation smart controls, we see the other smart controls, but we don't see the articulation one. So I think basically that doesn't really work like it's supposed to. So I would say don't use that. Even though it does give you a way of visually seeing what's set for each note, it's not very functional. It only works at the moment of writing it the first time. You can't come in and edit it, so I don't think it's very useful. So, is there another way of seeing what's set? There is. If we do view and set note color, we can change it to by articulation. So now you can see these are the yellow ones for the first one, the orange ones for the second ones, and the red ones, well, the reddish ones for the third one. And if we change the articulation type, it changes the color. So that works. It gives you a quick way of visualizing it. It's maybe not as good as it could be, but I'm sure that's something that will be improved in the future. So that's kind of the best we can do for viewing that, and maybe I shouldn't have gone into that rabbit hole of looking at the automation data because it just doesn't work. I don't think it's a good way of doing it, but at least you can see that that's kind of where it is and where you would expect it to be, but you can just see that it's not really functional like you would expect. So yeah, best option is probably just using the note color, which was view, set note color by articulation. Okay, I'm going to change it back to velocity though, because that's how I like it. All right. Let's see. There wasn't any other questions I wanted to talk about, but I wanted to talk about an issue that I've been having. And this is that I've noticed that with some plugins, I have a problem of the articulation change not triggering correctly when I'm using a note on message to trigger it. Now, I think the reason for this is basically, if you read the manual for some plugins, they do say when you're using key switches, you should make sure that the key switch message arrives before the actual note message. So if I want to play a note in one articulation, then put a key switch, and then play another note in the new articulation, I'm supposed to not quantize the key switch and the note to exactly the same point. I'm supposed to have the key switch message be just, a few ticks before the note message. So the reason for that is that it has time to receive the key switch command and change the articulation ready for when the next note is received. Now, when we set an articulation set in Logic using note on messages, they're essentially quantized. They're sent at precisely the same time. There's the note on message for the key switch and the note on message for the actual note that we want to produce, received at exactly the same time by the plugin. Now, I found that initially this is okay, but as a project gets bigger and I've got more and more instruments in the project and there's more for Logic to process, sometimes basically that note on message doesn't get there in time, and you'll find that the second note of a specific articulation works just fine, but the first note, it hasn't switched in time. So the way I fix this with some plugins that I use a lot is I'm using a controller message instead of a key switch. So I thought I'd just look at how that is set, because that might help some people out. So I've got a Kontakt instance here, and we're using a string sound. Let's just get rid of that. So Right now, the articulations, well, by default, they use key switches. You can see the region on the keyboard here that switches between the different key switches, between the different articulations, and you can see which note would trigger the articulations. It's much like we've looked at before. But what I've found is that because sometimes this will start to cause this problem of not getting the message in time, I found it's way better to switch this and use the MIDI CC information. So I switch it to MIDI CC. I've told it to just use channel 40. It's just a random number I chose because I know it's spare and I can remember it easily. So if I open up this articulation set, I'll show you what we've got set here. Articulations, I just set them all sequentially and just named them as the articulations are named in the plugin. But on the output, instead of using a note on message, now I'm using a controller message. So I've set all of them to controller message. Selector is 40 because that's the where it's expecting to receive it. And then the value, I've just set a number that's within the range that it expects for each one. So I found this to be more reliable. I think what's happening now is rather than each message being sent with a note on message, which can confuse it because it receives them at precisely the same time, instead now what we have is we have the note on message for the note that I wish to play, sent with CC data that says, oh, by the way, this is the articulation for it. In my experience, this is way more reliable. So where a plugin supports this, I would say do this rather than using the key switches. You may not have encountered the key switch problem that I was describing. It might just be me and my hardware that eventually the project's getting too big and I have these trouble. But something to bear in mind, I would recommend doing it this way when you can. Now, because we're using the MIDI CC the MIDI CC articulation switch rather than the key switches, you notice that I lose my key switches from the keyboard. If I switch back to key switch, there we go. Now I can use key switches. But now I've got MIDI CC, so I can't do it. So basically, this is why it's nice to have the switches pane. So I've come in here and set up my own key switches. So I've just recreated exactly what there was. You see we started with legato triggered by C0, going up to spizzicato on the F sharp 0, on pizzicato on G0. So I've recreated these, so now I switch to MIDI CC, but I set up my own switches to trigger these. So I still have those key switches. And this works as you would expect, so we're on pizzicato at the moment, and obviously I can switch using the articulation switcher. And yeah, we can also use the key switches. Now you have to make sure you click MIDI remote for this to work, but now I've got key switches which... Oh, where are they? There we go. Yeah, they were. I was in the wrong octave, but that's it. So I've still got these key switches. You can see as I hit the keys, the articulation set just changes up there. And it gives me that functionality back, but I'm still using the MIDI CC method of triggering these, which I find to be more reliable. So it's a good workaround to still have the key switches, but still use this more reliable way of doing it. And setting these up is straightforward. You just add them, change it to note on, say what note you want to use. And permanent, the default, what permanent means is after you hit this key, that will remain the current articulation until another permanent message is received. There's different ones. Momentary, I think, is just while it's held down within the specific range. And toggle, I forget what it was, it's in the manual. But permanent's probably what you're going to want to use in most cases. So yeah, just keep it on permanent, piece of cake. And we'll just get rid of that one. So that's it. I think that's everything I wanted to cover here. So yeah, quite a lot of versatility in this. Somebody commented and said, oh, you know, it's a shame that we can't do like an X and a Y dimension for the key switches, because if you've got a plugin that needs 2 bits of information, you know, like MIDI CC on one channel and MIDI CC on another, then yeah, you know, we can't do that yet, but I would hope that that comes at some point in the future. It's a pretty versatile functionality. I'm way happier with it now. I found that I can use, you know, this way of doing it rather than the key switches. It's way more reliable. And yeah, you know, the thing that we've looked at today in terms of queuing up a rack of instruments and having the different instruments from that rack triggered makes it really, really, really versatile. It's super useful. I've seen in the past there was paid plugins for Logic that recreated this functionality. So yeah, it's really nice to have this natively in Logic. So yeah, thank you for all the comments and questions on the last video. I do appreciate it. I hope this helps, and feel free to leave another, you know, if you've got any more questions at this point, do go ahead and leave a comment, and that's fine. If you want to subscribe to the channel, I will continue putting out videos, but at the moment I'm just kind of doing them when I find something that I think is worth sharing. So I'm not sort of actively making content. But if there's something you'd like to see me explain, go ahead and send me a message or leave a comment, and I'll maybe I'll get around to making a video about that sometime soon.